Friends, today I have a talk on T.S.Eliot's tradition and individual talent. It's a seminal essay published in 1960s when Eliot was already established as a full-fledged critic and a theorist. At the very beginning of the essay, he says that in England there is no tradition as such, and that word tradition is used in the derogatory sense, but it's not it in a true sense of the term. But on the contrary, he says that in France they have got a tradition, and the French have got a better sense of criticism than those of English. He makes a comparison between the French critics and the British critics, and the concept of tradition in British literature and in French literature. And the tradition, further says, it has a meaning of historical sense. All that is past is a tradition. The past of the country, and in his essay he says specifically the past of Europe, past of England, that's all a tradition. So tradition is understood to be the whole of the thought and practice of literature in the past. So the all literatures are linked to one another. For example, Greek and Roman literatures are related to later to English literature, as we study the first classical critics and then we come to neoclassical critics of England. So tradition is taken to be historical sense, and that historical sense should be borne by the poet. That he says, any poet, he should have the strong sense of the tradition. He should be in the tradition. Unless he is in the tradition, he cannot become a good poet. So, on the other hand, Eliot says that the poet has an individual talent. It means all persons do not have a talent to become poets. Only some have talents to become a poet. So there are two things. One, on the one hand, tradition, on the other hand, individual talent. So the individual talent belongs to the poet. So what he says, he should absorb all the tradition, not only of England, he says the tradition of Europe in him, and produce something of his own poetry. The poetry is based on his own experiences. He says that it is an emotional mainly, and as we say in Sanskrit poetics, emotion means rasa, rasa means emotion. So the poet, then while discussing the nature of the poet, he says the poet's mind is very receptive, unlike any other person's minds. It absorbs the images from the external world, and it has some kind of what you say, a conglomeration, a kind of a mixing in the subconscious of the poet. No poet can declare that he can instantly write a poem. If you ask to sit a poet in front of a tiger and ask him to write a poem on tiger, he cannot, because he is afraid of the tiger. He is afraid that at any moment it may pounce on him and eat. So he backs refers to the Wordsworth's two concepts, moment of experience and moment of expression. There should be a temporal gap between the two. So the poet writes poetry, and for that he uses the analogy of a laboratory. He says the poet's mind works like a catalyst, and it remains the same. So it absorbs all images and makes something of a new. So this is a very concrete thing. Of course, it may looks funny when you say that poet's mind is a laboratory. How it could be a laboratory? But we cannot take it as a literally. We cannot take it as a very apt analogy. But okay, some kind of convincing. He tries to convince us what goes on in the poet's subconscious. And he has made a target to Wordsworth, who says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Of course, I am not quoting it in full because I have a gap in the middle. So, spontaneous overflow, powerful feelings, dot, 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 dot. I have left something in the middle, recollected in tranquility. But here Eliot says there is no spontaneous overflow feelings and no tranquility and no recollection. According to him, he says that he has his own theory of poetic expression. He says that it is related to personality, and he says the poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. And further, he goes on saying that those who know have the personality, they know how to escape from personality. Others cannot escape from substance. They cannot write poetry. So, in this sense, he says, poetry is an escape from personality, not an expression of personality. Till that point, we had an impression that poet expresses his emotions and feelings. But he says, no, no, it's not like that. He says, it is an escaping personality. So he's trying to impersonalize his own feelings and emotions. He cannot directly say his own emotions. Otherwise, it becomes autobiographical, authentic, and it cannot be a poetry. It can't be universal. So, impersonality theory is very important as far as we understand Eliot's essay, "The Tradition, Individual Talent." And he also says that poet has a variety of subjects. He has nature, a love for nature, and he has love for the humanity, the human life as such. And poet, of course, he agrees with the language, it is emotive language, which is there. So, language of poetry is a language of emotion. So, what we understand is the difference between Wordsworth's definition of poetry and Eliot's definition of poetry. So, Eliot brings into discussion this concept of tradition. He said that tradition is linked with the poet, and the poet has an individual talent, and by the help of individual talent, he absorbs the tradition. He does not repeat anything. He makes something new, something innovative, but not altogether new. No, it is all rooted in the past in that sense. So he creates something of his own, which looks new, novel, and he is in the tradition. And after saying this in the second part, he says, he comes to criticism of the poet, how to evaluate, and he says that no, you can't just um, uh, evaluate a poet in isolation. He has to be evaluated in relation to other poets of his times and the poets of the dead and all that. So to keep these important points about Eliot's definition of poetry has the related tradition and individual concept is a way of way of explaining creative process of poetry and his own definition of poetry, which is different that from that of Wordsworth and his own way of critical evaluation of the poets. Thank you.